Okay, this next video is going to talk about some lesser used, in practical terms, types of validity. The first is criterion validity, and there are two types. One is concurrent and predictive. And the idea is, say that you have a measure and you believe that your measure or your assessment is really doing what you want it to do. The question is, how do you know? Unless you have something else to compare it to, you never really can be sure. And this is one of the reasons why in assessment there's a general philosophy that you need to use multiple methods of assessment. Any method, any single method that you use will have limitations, and you have to be able to think seriously and honestly about what those limitations might be. Whenever, for instance, they make new products, like we have here a traditional leveling device, and they develop a laser level. Well, the question is, when you develop something new, how do you know that it's any good? Well, you compare it with this or other measurements, and if everything agrees, if there's concurrence between, and concurrence means agreement, between the different things, then you assume that everything, is right. This applies when you're looking at different versions of tests. How people do on Iowa Basics or Terra Nova or the WKCE or Smarter Balanced or the ACT or SAT. All those things should agree, and if they don't, there's a problem. If you're looking for a car, right, don't just go with Motor Trend, but look at and see what Consumer Reports say. Look to see what U.S. News and World Reports or Forbes or any other one of the major car rating systems, because they use different criteria, and some weigh reliability more, some weigh safety more, some weigh gas mileage and eco-friendliness more, and so you have to consider the source and how they might be different. But if they all agree that this is a really good car, well, then you should feel pretty confident. Same goes with movie reviews, same goes with school rankings. Now that's concurrent validity, and the idea is that you're looking for multiple measures of the same thing in really the same time frame. Now that's different from predictive validity, which means that I'm going to use an indicator at one time to predict how someone is going to do or perform at a later time, and possibly during a slightly different task. So when you take your college admissions tests, those are only good insofar as they actually predict how well people do in college. And the correlation is about 0.5, which may not mean anything to you, but it means that about 25% of how people do can be explained by these college admissions tests. The other 75%, well, that's just other stuff. You have dress rehearsals for plays, right? You go through rehearsals, and if the rehearsals go well, you assume that the show will go well. But it's different a little bit when you're standing in front of thousands or hundreds of people. Nerves and other things might, cause a breakdown. You have athletic tryouts, you have practice exams in your class, you will have homeworks, right? And the idea is that if somebody is doing well on all these homework activities or in-class exercises or practice exams that you've set up to get people comfortable or to move them towards your ultimate learning objectives, if they're doing well on those, they should do well on the test. If you have kids who do well on everything that is, it's supposed to be predicting test performance for you and for them, and it doesn't match up, that's a problem. If you have some who are high and some who are low, and their test results are identically the same, well then that's good. Because you do have some sense of predictive validity. So this idea of criterion validity is really looking at multiple measures and doing some comparison and making sure that everything is in agreement. Sometimes it's at the same time or supposed to be representing the same time frame. Other times it's looking across time and using one thing to predict performance on something else. The other type is construct validity. And just to say what a construct is, it is something like intelligence, happiness, wisdom, beauty, knowledge that we talk about but we can't directly see or point to or measure. So we have to look for some kind of behaviors or some kind of attributes or some kinds of things that we can directly measure to determine whether or not intelligence exists and at what level it exists, whether somebody's happy or not, whether somebody is wise, whether something is beautiful, whether someone's depressed or just sad, things like that. When we are doing this, because there are so many overlapping things, we look at two different things. One is convergence, and it's the idea that things that are supposed to measure the same thing really all agree and come up with the same results. Now, simple example for this general idea is, if you look at this set of questions about pizza knowledge, if that's my construct, again, your pizza knowledge is something I can't directly see or measure or observe. I have to ask you questions to look for behaviors. If I asked, which of these would have a low level of convergent validity, I'm asking which of these questions doesn't really agree with the others. And if I look at this, question number 4, is the one that doesn't really fit, right? What are the names of the pizza delivery people in your area? Well, you may not have a Pizza Hut. Doesn't mean you don't know anything about pizza. Or you may never order delivery. Or you may, like most people, never ask the name of your Pizza Hut delivery person. Now that's the idea that if somebody could score high on everything else, generally indicating a high level of pizza knowledge, but they might score low on that one. And I might see that trend throughout everything. So people who score high on everything else tend to get a low score on get number 4 wrong. People who score low on most things probably also score low on 4, but they might actually score a little bit better on 4. Who knows, right? The idea is that there is not agreement, there is not convergence among all these different indicators. 4 kind of sticks out as something that's a little bit different. The other side of this is that if I make a test to measure some kind of construct, I should be able to discriminate between it and other related items, or break down the broader construct into subconstructs. And again, it's based on looking at how the item responses fall together. Now, in this case, if we're looking at this set of pizza questions that remain, right, I can look at these and I can see that there are 2 subconstructs that are really identified or highlighted in here. One is about ingredients, and the second set is about baking. And when I look at that, right, people scores on questions 1 through 4 for themselves should be much closer, right? If you know about ingredients, you have a better chance of scoring well on any one of these. Doesn't necessarily relate to the baking. Unless you spend time baking, you may not know a lot about it. So in other words, a young child who eats pizza all the time but just has it served to them might score well on 1 through 4, but the second subconstruct about baking pizza, they would probably score a little bit lower on. And in general, this is the pattern we would look for. Groups of items that kind of hang together, and there are slight differences, and the relationships between 1 through 4 within that group should be a lot stronger than how 1 through 4 are related to 5 through 7. There should be still some relationship because it is still under this broad umbrella of pizza knowledge, but the relationships within the groups, the subconstructs, should be stronger than between the subconstructs. Another example is, differentiating between sadness and depression if I'm talking about a general construct of negative emotions. Even though they're similar, right, a good assessment tool should be able to discriminate or tell the difference between those things and know when somebody is just sad, which is temporary, doesn't necessarily involve some certain types of eating or sleeping patterns, but may, and then whether or not they are actually depressed, which does involve those things. Another example might be talking about fractions in terms of general school knowledge, right? Now, fractions is a broad construct. It can be broken down into different parts or subconstructs. Adding fractions, subtracting fractions, dividing fractions, multiplying fractions, and so on. And within each one of these, I have my simple fractions, my mixed numbers, my improper fractions, greatest common denominators, least common multiple, decimal places, and division, and all that other stuff that goes with it. So this is a complicated area. A good assessment tool should be able to break down and discriminate whether somebody is doing well at this, but has a problem with this and is only okay with this. My assessment should be able to give me that information and not just a single overall score. Similarly, in social studies, right, I have my social studies lesson. It breaks down into talking about, if we're talking about Spanish expansion, right, the relevant people, the relevant dates, the relevant places, the relevant events. And somebody may, in general, be good, but they may have differences between each one of these things. If I'm talking about on the item to item level, if I'm asking several questions about different people, right? I may have a question here that doesn't seem to fit, that people who generally score well on the people section of this overall construct tend to get 3 wrong, and people who score poorly tend to get 3 right. And I would say to myself, that doesn't seem to make sense. And I would have to look at that question and see, am I measuring something else? Or is it worded poorly? Or is it just not related to what I'm really talking about? And I have to figure out what the problem was, because I should have convergence within a subconstruct. I should also be able to discriminate between, right, different subconstructs, and so on. Now, if I'm thinking about the different factors that impact validity, right, for content validity, the thing that we care about the most, really, in terms of practical applications, I'm looking for mismatches in the level of cognition represented in the goals and in the questions or the assessment items. I'm also looking for things that are extra or things that I didn't put in there. I'm also looking for overall balance, or whether or not I have a representative sample or a non-representative sample. I want to make sure that my learning objectives are clearly and perfectly reflected in my assessment. In terms of construct validity, things I'm looking for, are reading and vocabulary, sentence structure, being too difficult in the questions or the directions if that's not what I'm trying to measure. If it is what I'm trying to measure, it's not a problem. However, but if I have a word problem in math, right, and I have a kid who can't read very well, the question doesn't really assess their pure math ability if that's what I'm trying to assess. I'm assessing both their reading ability and their math ability. If I don't give people enough time, I'm not just assessing whether or not they can do something, but how fast they can do it. Sometimes I care about that. A lot of times I don't. I need to think about whether or not my items themselves are constructed well. Do they give unintended clues? Are there unreasonable options? Are there syntactical errors that make the question more difficult? If I keep going with test issues, I could think of whether or not my items on my test are arranged appropriately. And if I start out with the hardest question in the world, I probably will cause a lot of frustration and lower performance on the overall test than if I would start with some easier questions and work my way towards more challenging thing. Finally, for item 5 here, I'm making sure I don't have any other kinds of clues in terms of response patterns that are obvious. Again, because that would make it so I'm not really measuring the construct I want to measure. In terms of criterion validity, using only one form of assessment and ignoring other important indicators would be a serious violation of this, right? I want to use multiple methods. I want to give them equal consideration in order to get at the truth. And so I can make some good, valid inferences about what my students have learned, what they haven't learned, what I taught well, what I didn't teach well, and what I might change going forward. Other things that I can think of, administration factors, how long it takes me to grade might change how I assign grades, the different procedures and resources I use in testing and how susceptible things are to cheating, student factors that really impact reliability but will ultimately impact validity, right? Test anxiety and motivation. These are really reliability things. My group factors, whether I have some kind of bias in my tests. And then if I'm looking across like homework to tests or any other kind of predictive validity issue, how closely do my assessments match up? If my homework is totally different from my summative assessments, the final unit tests, I might have a problem, and I wouldn't be making good decisions if I'm basing performance on two very different tasks off of one another. Now, the last thing is, if you want to figure out if things are going well and you have created a good test, right, you can focus on content validity and purity in the sense of making sure that there is perfect alignment between your tests and your goals. Now, the steps are right here. Define the domain or task to be measured, how to line up. So the second thing, especially for higher level thinking, all the level 3 stuff, but also for level 2, it's not so much a problem for recall. But think about the problem solving process. If you make a task, what do your students have to do in order to be successful? Are you really measuring at the right level of cognition? And we'll spend some time going through some examples with this in our group meetings and in class. Consider the other factors that influence the outcome. Make sure that things are unbiased. Bias is really a special form of validity. 4, make sure that the assessment scores are improving during practice, and then use summative assessment to record. So in other words, if you're assessing your students and you're teaching and you're assessing and you're teaching and the test scores aren't going up, either the test is bad or your instruction is bad. And one of those two things have to go, or the kids don't care. But which would mean that your instruction is not really engaging or motivating. Finally, check to see that all your results are reflected in other measures. Kids are doing well in your class, how are they doing others, and on standardized tests. Look at the school tests, the state tests, any national tests, and if there's any mismatch there, that requires further consideration. If everything lines up, then you're probably okay. Maybe not, but probably. And that's about it. So, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm sure you did. And if you have any questions, let me know.